Critical race theory, or CRT, has a lot of parents pretty upset around the country. But what the heck even is it? We've got a great guest coming up for you today. This is the Jobob Show. Thanks for tuning in. It starts right now.
3, 2, 1.
Here we go. Live from the dingy bunker, completely cut off from the outside world. My name is Jobob. This is the Jobob Show. Thank you for tuning in. A lot of headlines happening today that we're not going to get into because we've got a guest and we've got a topic, and we're actually really excited about that. But we may get into that stuff tomorrow. Shoot, Kevin Kiley's on tomorrow, so I'm not sure we'll get to it tomorrow. But anyways, the New York Times actually had a really interesting piece talking about the mask mandates coming out of the CDC, which is, again, interesting coming from the New York Times and or not a conservative media outlet. But we're not going to cover that today. We do have a great guest coming up to talk about critical race theory, CRT. People have been hearing that term going around the country. It's getting into schools. School districts are picking up practices that probably don't align with how most of us think. But we also want to talk about what the heck critical race theory even is, kind of the history of it. And again, we got a great guest coming up for you in just a few seconds. But first, I want to tell you about capitalist propaganda. Tell your friends their socialist ideas totally suck with the latest capitalist propaganda gear. Head on over to capitalistpropaganda.us, where you can find this. Only you can help spread capitalist propaganda to defeat the empire. This is the one I'm wearing today. You're welcome, capitalist propaganda. This is probably my favorite one. Go ahead, use your iPhone to tweet about how much you hate me. A lot of cool designs over at capitalistpropaganda.us. Again, apparently we need to support capitalism because that's a thing that people are arguing against. I kind of figured it had been proven over and over again that capitalism is the best way to govern a society, but such is the modern political world. So, without further ado, our guest today is Mike Steger from LaRouche PAC, and we're going to talk about critical race theory, kind of the history of it all. And he comes in right now. Mike, how you doing?
Great, Joe Bob. Nice to see you.
Good to see you too. So, to kind of kick things off on a broad, surfacey level before we kind of dive into the origins, I guess, of critical race theory or critical theory in general and how that transformed into critical race theory. How do you see this being played out like right now? What is critical race theory, how the normal American views it, and how is that either good, bad, problematic? What's your take on it from a removed average American experience?
Yeah, I think that it's split at this point in terms of how Americans see it. Some people think it's a way of addressing the problems our country went through in the past.
Yeah.
Other people see it as a direct threat to the very fabric of our nation, our mission, our social cohesion. And I would say that that's the right view. The reason they call it critical race theory is to give it some kind of academic cover, some kind of blanket you're hiding the real substance of it so that the liberal side of the nation is somehow drawn into this kind of thing. Because really, it has nothing to do with an academic law theory. It really is a threat to the way our nation and even our civilization function.
Yeah. Now, I guess to be fair, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the way I understand it is it started kind of coming out of Harvard Law School and then has somehow morphed into something else. Whatever's being done in the school isn't technically critical race theory being taught. It's more of a deviation out of whatever came out of a law school in the 70s. Is that more or less accurate in your mind?
Well, I think that in some sense they brought this legal theory in, which I think started at some level from the fact that affirmative action, the civil rights movement, did not accomplish the gains that people thought it would. That the economic ability, the economic standard of living, the social integration of a nation that should have taken place, from the peak of the civil rights movement in the early 60s and Martin Luther King's leadership, which was at that time fundamentally a Christian-led process oriented around the family, looking to working class, middle class African Americans, integrating them into society. But the economy was shut down. There was not an ongoing sense of economic growth. So they came up with critical race theory. Okay, fine. The bigger question is that the reason the economy shut down is the same actual philosophy that they're pushing in schools today. It's rabid existentialism, it's rabid environmentalism, and it's rabid this idea of kind of ethnic separations and tribes. And that's really the problem.
So I did a deep dive on one of our episodes of Quality Control over on Daily Caller, but I kind of really focused on the 70s until now. So from Marcusa to like Ibram X. Kendi. But you'd mentioned this sort of thinking has been going on far before that. You want to dive into that a little bit of what, again, I'm an expert from here, not an expert. I understand a lot from here to here. Here to here, I almost have no idea about, and that's kind of how we got connected, as you're talking about the history of all of this. So you want to expand a little bit on what your thoughts are previous to the 1970s?
Yeah, I mean, what people have to understand is that the United States was an expression of the height of Western civilization. The ideas that came in to define the United States and its principles were at the highest levels of scientific, cultural, and philosophical understanding over 1,700, 2,000 years. And Lincoln represented that. Lincoln brought that to bear. He was very conscious of it. He was saying, look, the revolutionary generation has gone. They're no longer around. We have to revive these principles, this cultural outlook. We have to refound the nation. Yeah. But by the turn of the 20th century, that Lincoln legacy, in some ways, they killed the last Lincoln Republican, William McKinley. But at that point of the turn of the 20th century, you saw a cultural attempt to fundamentally undermine not just the fabric of our own nation, our own understanding, but also of Western civilization. And that leads into, you get people like Bertrand Russell, famously said, why I am not a Christian, rejects God, rejects the immortality of the human soul, which is a kind of a Nietzschean concept. But then you get this extreme German existentialism, Martin Heidegger, that leads into the people like Jean-Paul Sartre. You get Frantz Fanon, purgative violence, and that's where you start to see it, that this kind of 50s and 1960s program culturally. And, to be honest with you, you'll even find elements of the CIA directly pushing these kinds of concepts and issues in places like Africa, in places like Paris, around this existentialist far left outlook. It was called the Congress of Cultural Freedom. And so there's a hard push to kind of remove from the American people that spirit, that sense of principle of not our nation, but also our civilization.
So the way, if people don't know this, the way it works is there's critical theory, and that's kind of like at the hierarchy, at the top of the hierarchy, and then you've got little spokes. Critical race theory is one of the spokes. And so in order to understand critical race theory, I think a lot of people need to grapple with critical theory, which is an ideology, but at the same time, to my understanding, is more of a strategy. And can you kind of elaborate on what that strategy is meant to do? It kind of ties in with what you're talking about a little bit earlier. Yeah, sure.
Underlying this whole program philosophically is the idea that we really can't know. We really can't advance as a species, as a people, right? That's the idea. So you somehow have to say who are the winners and who are the losers. You have to kind of impose an irrationality. And that's where this kind of the Hegel, the German philosophical tenets, it broke. If you go back to the philosophy in Germany, people like Gottfried Leibniz, Nicholas of Cusa, you find real tenets of a higher conception that shaped even the founding of the country. We had a lot of German immigrants coming in the 1700s that shaped even our outlook as a country. But by the time you get this increasing degree of irrationalism, it comes out of the French Revolution. And you can see it, right? You see that there are direct parallels to what we're pushing today, and like a Jacobin mob in France and the guillotine and all the rest. Critical theory coming out of Germany in the 30s and making its way over to the United States. And the idea of confusing, which you kind of mentioned a little bit, is really a core component of the strategy
right? Not necessarily the ideology. The part of the strategy is just confusing the heck out of people. What it seems like.
Yeah.
Part of an example of that is I want to play this clip from Ibram X. Kendi, Ibram Rogers. What's his name? Henry Rogers. I don't know if you knew that. His real name is like Henry Rogers. Changed it to Ibram X. Kendi because it sounds more in line with what he does.
Edgy, yeah, more radical.
Yeah. And it does. He does sound more edgy, more radical.
Look, it's a marketing plan. That's what this is. A marketing plan to sell people total irrationality. That's what it is. Yeah, and they're good at marketing. I mean, they run Madison Avenue.
So we're going to play a little clip of Ibram X. Kendi. Again, keep in mind the objective here is to just confuse the heck out of people. So follow along with this and let me know what you think. This is Ibram X. Kendi defining racism.
Anti-racism is a collection of anti-racist policies.
Defining racism, but I unless I missed it, which is possible. I didn't hear your personal definition. Is there one that you would offer us? Like, how do you define racism?
Sure. So racism, I would define it as a collection of racist policies that lead to racial inequity that are substantiated by racist ideas.
What?
Yeah.
So, in your mind, what did he just say there? What do you think he just said?
Yeah. Racism is racism. I mean, these people aren't the brightest, right? I mean, they put up people that are willing to push the line. They're selling an irrational dogma. They're trying to find people that they think can sell it. It's like selling shoes. If you try to find the best spokesman, but you're asking people to buy into something that's fundamentally anti-human. I mean, he's pushing a policy which is itself destructive to him and into his own society. So, these people aren't bright. It's why the academy is collapsing, because you've recruited the worst and worst people. It's like you fail upwards. It's same with the government and a lot of the various bureaucracies. It's people have failed upwards, and you end up with people like this who have no idea what they're talking about. But, it makes people, we really have, our culture's gotten so self-absorbed. I mean, I think a lot of this really comes from Obama. Obama introduced a kind of narcissism and made narcissism normal. And I think that really is the reason people can buy into this and even sit there and listen to that guy.
That's interesting. That's an interesting take. I've never heard anybody say Obama made narcissism normal. Obama's a fantastic politician. Now, I don't really agree with him policy-wise, but the guy was a rock star. And you're kind of saying that his ability to do that made it kind of normal for people to, normalize narcissistic tendencies, which is what it takes in order to be a political rock star. He kind of normalized that. That's interesting. I've never heard of that thought before, but it kind of makes sense to me.
Well, it was set up, right? I mean, what was set? Obama's the operation behind Obama, because this guy was a deep run operation. The guy was a nobody in the in the Illinois Congress. I mean, who knows what his background was? It was hard to figure out.
Yeah, organizer.
Community organizer. What was he doing in Indonesia as a kid? What was his stepfather doing? I mean, the guy was notoriously, apparently, a major violent butcher in the Indonesian purging. His stepfather, when he lived in Indonesia, Barry Sotoro. So the guy's a strange background. His mother was kind of part of this anthropology deployed networks, kind of intel in terms of these developing countries. So the guy's a very strange person in terms of his background. But what he brought to bear, and the people around him, largely his controllers, Valerie Jarrett, this type of thing, they brought this extreme irrationality and narcissism, not just in the culture, but to the highest level of our government. You saw it because he launched 9 wars. I mean, the guy was just, he opened up massive drug legalization. There are so many aspects of what happened under Obama, yet people saw him as a peace president. I mean, you still to this day have people who finally realized that after it took a while, but people on the left said, wait a minute, Glenn Greenwald today, people on the left are now supporting the CIA and the FBI in suppressing American citizens for expressing their freedom of speech. It's like, when did that happen? Well, it was under this extreme presidency of Obama. As bad as the wars of Bush and Cheney were, Obama was something. I mean, we compared him to Emperor Nero because that's probably the closest he's come. I mean, it really was a strange personality and disposition. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know anything about the past stuff. I know him as a very good politician. Disagree with him on a lot of policy
Well,
stuff.
he reads the teleprompter better than anybody. But,
Yeah.
but that's because he'll say anything, just like Ibram Kendi will. Like most of
Yeah.
these people, you give them a teleprompter and say, "Well, make you famous if you read this," and they read it, and that's what they do. And Obama just did that incredibly well.
So to get back on track a little bit, that Ibram X. Kendi clip, I want to play just a couple seconds after when he defined racism in his very weird way. Listen to this. They're confused
A
too.
collection of racist policies that lead to racial inequity that are substantiated by racist ideas.
So everybody in the audience also laughed and was like, that doesn't make any sense. It's kind of like the joke I made on the Daily Caller show is, it's kind of like someone asking, well, why is Kim Kardashian famous? Because she's famous. So the idea behind this, the way I understand it, is that the objective is just to confuse the crap out of people. You have anti-racism, which sounds good if you don't dig into it a little bit further, right? Like, am I off track here? Because that's the way I understand the objective of just confusing people with nonsense of words that don't make any sense.
Well, I mean, let's be honest. I think that, they have all these bills that state legislators are trying to pass that will ban critical race theory. Mm-hmm. But they've been teaching this kind of outlook for a long time.
Yeah, what's that? Howard Zinn is the biggest history book, and it's not very friendly to the United States of America.
I mean, it rejects any idea that you can actually have scientific progress in a society, right? That every step that is taken, yes, we have more people living at a higher standard of living than we've ever had in human history, and yet it's all based on criminality. That somehow progress, having more people, having a higher population, all of this is based on criminality. It's like, that's not possible unless you're defining that too many people are a sign of are an expression of evil, not good, right? You'd actually have to be able to say the growth of population is an evil thing, and so therefore it's based on criminality.
Yeah,
and that's really what they're pushing, and they've been pushing it for 50, 60 years in the schools.
Interesting. So with the strategy behind confusing people, they've also shown their colors a little bit. I've got a clip from Patrisse Cullors, who's the founder or co-founder of Black Lives Matter, talking about her ideology and
from one of her mansions, I guess, right?
Yeah, from one of her 5 houses. So take a listen to this.
I think is that we actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists. We are.
So sits there and says we're trained Marxists. Again, when you say trained Marxists, it sounds less like an ideology and more like a strategy. As in, the critical theory that came out of Germany in the 30s is but founded upon a lot of these Marxist ideas in terms of a strategy in which you have to tear down the system and then rebuild it, which is what it seems like Patrisse Cullors is advocating for. And how do you tear down a system? Well, you just confuse the heck out of the people by telling them that racism is racism, and therefore not giving them a concrete definition, and watch society go off the rails by using verbiage that doesn't mean anything to say something that isn't really even true. Right.
Yeah. I mean, what I hear is just severe collective narcissism, where you have these young people who have no idea what they're even doing. They want everything to be about them.
Yeah.
Somehow, some way, right? Make this about me somehow, some way. Okay, make it about my skin color. I mean, it really is. It's a very negative, detrimental view of oneself. She's defining herself by an ideology and a skin color. That's insane. You're a human being. You have a divine creative quality. There's no expression of that at all. There's no concern for the other. There's no concern for the society or its future. It's all about, we need retribution for the past. It's fixated on a past that they're then defining. But how much education does she even have? Does she know really the history of our country, of civilization, even the history of Africa? Does she even know any of this? Or is she just put up there as one more talking head, kind of bumbling away, confusing people? And that's really what, that's the problem, is we need more and more clarity on what is our mission. right? The
Yeah.
reason these people can feed on kind of a naive, you could say well-intended liberal but naive American population, especially younger people, is because the mission of our nation, the mission of our society is not clear. And so these people can come up with one that says the mission is to destroy what's there. It's like, well,
well, and then confusing people into being complicit with what they're doing, right? Because if you don't know that that's the objective, and then you hear words like anti-racism or equity being thrown around, your first thought is, well, yeah, I think those are good things, until you dig deep into them, and which most people don't do. Most people are barely paying attention, if at all. But you see an Instagram post that say, we need to promote equity. Equity is the dumbest thing I've ever heard of in my entire life. It's just not possible. It doesn't make any sense. It is the equal outcome of an individual based on nothing else other than we need to be equal in terms of outcome. Makes no sense to me whatsoever. It doesn't have any basis in the way humans function. Yet people say we need equity because nobody knows what it means. And so that, I think, is part of the idea behind this subset of critical theory, critical race theory, is to just confuse people and say, well, yeah, I'm not racist. That means I'm anti-racist. I don't think you know what anti-racist means, because once you start doing anti-racist things, that, in my opinion, is racist. But it's not what you think. It isn't what you think. And so I kind of leads us into a next clip from Robin DiAngelo, who is the author of White Fragility. I said, what was it, on a couple days ago, I was talking to another friend, and we were talking about, I read one of Robin DiAngelo's earlier books, and it was almost comical. The entire first half of the book was basically saying, this is a very complex, complicated theory. And if you don't agree with it, that just means you don't understand it and you're not smart enough to understand it. And what 20-year-old college sociology major is going to read that and think, oh, I guess I'm just not smart enough? No, they all want to be, I'm smart enough, I understand it, therefore I agree. It's just confusing. So anyways, this clip from Robin DiAngelo on one of your big time alphabet networks talking about racism, and well, I'll ask you the question after you listen to it.
You cannot talk about any other issue without talking about how race informs that issue.
So you can't talk about any other issue without talking about how race informs that issue. Hey, Mike, what kind of refrigerator do you have? Do you know the brand?
It's white.
Because apparently you can't talk about anything unless race is the center of that issue. Yeah. So my question for you is, are people like that fully bought into the system in which they're talking about, or are they kind of just like, I don't know, how does someone like that get there, do you think?
Oh, I mean, this is this fail upwards approach. They've deconstructed any kind of notion of real education. So you go to college, you get into Black studies, gender studies, and it becomes more and more about studying your tribe, yourself. Where do you place yourself in this group mentality? And groupthink is the peril of any society. I mean, people start to think as a group and not as individuals, then society can't survive. And that's but people who are afraid, who don't have confidence in their own ability to think, become people like Robin DiAngelo. Yeah, that's the problem.
There's one more clip that we have that I think is really fun. It's a professor at I believe it's Penn State talking to a couple students. We'll just listen and then give some commentary.
Who have you guys oppressed today?
I haven't oppressed anyone today.
Are you sure of that, dude? You're breathing. Have you left your house today?
Yes.
Okay, so you may have oppressed somebody. And
dude, are you breathing? You may have oppressed somebody. So
imagine a professor saying, dude. At that point, you're like, wait a minute, am I paying for this? Like, what is this?
Dude, you oppressed somebody today? So here's, I guess, what I'm trying to figure out. So I think, and tell me what you think, I think there are two kind of separate polarizing, separate factions of this movement. On the one hand, you've got the people that understand that critical theory and critical race theory is a strategy used to tear down the system. I think Ibram Kendi's on that side. I think Patrisse Cullors is on that side. I think they understand that what they're doing is not necessarily pushing a sort of ideology. What they're doing is trying to tear down the structural society as we see it today in order to build something else new from it. And then I think you have the other camp who actually buys into the ideology. And it's difficult differentiating between the two, but I think those are the two kind of components. I don't know. What are your thoughts? Do you think that obviously there's some blur?
I think that's right. I mean, you have the cynics and you have the naive, and the cynics are basically manipulating those who are naive.
Cynics and the naive. I love that.
Yeah. I mean, it's typical. It's typical kind of. It's pathological. I mean, these people are just preying on people they know just really want to be a good person. Right before they would have been the devout churchgoers. Today they're the people that, don't bring their own canvas bags to the grocery store and make sure they recycle everything and divide it into various camps. They really want to make sure that when society says this is what a good person is, you have a lot of people that say, well, I want to be a good person.
And who controls that conversation? Like, where's that expectation coming from? I mean, obviously from the media, but how does it get there?
Well, that's why you have to go back, I believe, really towards how it was targeted U.S. culture, because it was been somewhat dominant in Europe for a long time. It's probably why people left Europe to found the United States. But at the turn of the 20th century, they went after our sense. I mean, John Dewey educational system, Bertrand Russell and new mathematics. They imposed, instead of creative thinking and physical science, they imposed total adherence to logic. They started to attack the underlying foundations of real economy, of industry, of industrial progress. So they went after us in the 20th century. So it's been a long kind of, the boiling frog, been boiled for a long time.
I'm not familiar with that metaphor.
The idea that if you boil a frog slowly, it won't jump out of the pot, right? If all of a sudden everything's good in society, right, and then all of a sudden you try to turn up this irrational heat like this, then people would have said in the late 19th century, when there was a sense of there was more blacks in Congress than there are today, right? I mean, this kind of, people would be like, this is insane thinking. But when you boil people down, when you've actually undermined their educational perspectives for over a century, I mean, how do they suck us into World War I? Why do we have a Federal Reserve controlled by Wall Street banks running our financial system? I mean, these kinds of things took place over the last century, and yet now we have, a Federal Reserve, perpetual bailouts. I can say one of the reasons why I think the younger generation is susceptible, maybe to get specifically to your question, is the bailouts and the home foreclosures in 2008 and the blowout of the housing bubble really affected this millennial generation. I've talked to a number of them. Their parents were foreclosed. They couldn't go to college. Or their economic standards collapsed a lot. And yet they didn't get any real help. A lot of the American people were left to survive on their own, while the big banks got an unlimited, tens of trillions of dollars in bailouts. That creates an anger. And that's what these people like Kendi or really the Soroses, they play on that.
Gotcha. Okay, I was going to ask, how does that tie into that? So, going back to the cynics versus the naive, does that generally make people cynical? And how do you think that group is separated? Because you've got, the biggest institutions in the world jumping on the bandwagon, as you've seen. You've got Nike, Disney, all big conglomerates jumping on the bandwagon of wokeness, for lack of a better term. What percentage of that do you think is like cynics over here and the naive part over here?
Yeah, I mean, I think most of the population that goes along with it is just grossly naive. I mean, we haven't educated a population. I mean, these last 20 years, you think about post 9/11, what's happened to our country.
Mm-hmm. How do you fix that?
How do you fix it? That's a good question. My sense, and this is what we focus on at LaRouche PAC, is how do we bring back, because you have to find a way of social cohesion. I have an uncle who always says, you're never going to find it without a war. Now, that's
no, seriously. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's how older generations. That's where you got cohesion. Like, okay, we have an external enemy, go fight. But then we were manipulated, right? Post 9/11, they said Saddam Hussein and Iraq is our enemy, and everyone's like, wait a minute now, that didn't work. Now they're trying to turn the enemy into the American people, right? I mean, that's how crazy it's gotten. So the enemies of our country that deployed this culture look to create a false sense of social cohesion. I think the real cohesion is in a sense of real growth, right? What Trump did with the Artemis project, the space program, with a revival and a push for nuclear power. Let's expand our energy base. Let's expand our manufacturing and industry. Let's get people with jobs. Let's allow people who are 25 and with a decent job to buy a home. Like, create an opportunity for growth and development, not just on a macro scale where you can say the stock market's up or profits are up, but that on the individual level, the individual person says, I can see myself really growing in my lifetime. I can see myself being able to grow a family, grow a business, develop, and contribute something to my society. We have to, if we can create that kind of mission again. And I think the space program is a big part of it, because it does drive a lot of technological advancement that you can bring back into the economy. But that kind of mission is probably the only way. And it doesn't, you're not going to fix it in a day, right? You're going to have to commit to it. And I think if we do that, we can pull our nation back from the precipice, because we're certainly there. They're pushing us up against a wall really hard, or a cliff. You know, it's getting bad.
So going back to what you said about individuals, what do you say to people that say, well, I can't as an individual? Because that's part of this whole critical race theory thing, is telling people, you know, you're a brown guy with a hillbilly name. Well, you can't do anything, which I think is ridiculous. I grew up in a neighborhood where I've got a immigrant dad and a white mom, and none of that. I didn't know that was any different than anybody else. But given the fact that, you know, what's going on is kind of telling people you're in this hole as an individual and you can't get out. What do you say to counteract that thought, which is being pushed by your critical race theory enthusiasts?
Right. Well, this is a challenging question, but it's called real moral and intellectual leadership. I mean, we have to create and inspire more people to take up the mantle of people that people like Abraham Lincoln took. I mean, think about Joan of Arc as an example, kind of a bizarre, but you know, here's a young girl, 16, 17 years old. She comes to the crisis of her country where the king and the other leaders aren't willing to lead and establish France as an actual nation. And really, because of her sacrifices, she helps to establish the first nation state. You know, that kind of devotion and leadership is irreplaceable. I think what Trump has done has been irreplaceable. It's that quality of moral and intellectual leadership to fight because he knows it's existential. I think we need more people. If you have a small grouping, especially of young people like yourself, who really take up a sense of leadership, like you're doing with these discussions, then you start to create something of real value. Not the anger, not the self-absorption, not the existential outlook that these guys are pushing, which really is not appealing. It's only appealing if you say everybody thinks that way, it's popular opinion, you have to go along with it. But if people see that you don't, and that you can be happy as an individual creative thinker, I think we can expose these fools for what they are.
Gotcha. Well, cool, man. I really appreciate the conversation. You got a lot of insight that I kind of miss from the historical component. You know, kind of as we wrap up, do you have any last thoughts of just kind of, I don't know, summing things up and trying to, in a concise way, describe all of everything?
I mean, the one thing I would just say is this country is the most beautiful country mankind has ever created. It's based on an idea of mankind that is a divine, creative, immortal creature, right? That's where those inalienable rights and equality stem from. And if we have people willing to commit to that and bring that kind of creativity, which includes humor and ridicule, I think we should make fun of these people. We should take them seriously and have some fun, because really we're going to create the best nation that's ever existed. We're going to regrow it, refound it, and people should join that kind of fight.
Yeah, Mike, just so you know, this is generally a more lighthearted show, but this is a serious topic. There's a lot less laughing today than I think there normally is, except for when Ibram Kendi decides to define racism, which is ridiculous. You had to laugh at that. But yeah, no, I agree with you. The idea of this rigidity of politics is, I don't know, doesn't generally work. Well, it works for some generations, but I think the new generation coming up, you gotta be a little bit lighthearted and be able to poke fun at some of the ridiculous stuff, because I don't know. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I see a lot of people that are arguing against CRT, talking in very serious terms, knocking down serious arguments. Guys like James Lindsay or all of his cabal of people. All of those people are talking very serious terms, and it doesn't appear to me that anybody's just like laughing at it, which I think is a hole that we're trying to fill here.
It's true. You're doing a great job, and you should keep it up.
Thanks. Well, awesome. Mike Steger of LaRouche PAC. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll have to have you on again when school starts, and I'm sure things are going to get all riled up even more after that takes place. But thanks so much for joining us. We had a great conversation.
Thanks, Jobob. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, man. Those of you who are tuned into all of that, great. For any of you who missed a certain part of it, go ahead and watch the playback on Facebook. It's also up on Spotify Podcasts. We're working on getting it up on Apple Podcasts. But you can listen to the entire conversation with Mike Steger of LaRouche PAC regarding CRT, the kind of the history of it, where it is now. I loved his cynics versus naive, because there are people that are cynical and understand what critical race theory really is as a strategy to tear down the system, versus the people that are naive and kind of go, well, I'm not racist, so I must be anti-racist, which is not at all the same thing. But anyways, really enjoyed the conversation. If you missed any part of it, go check it out on the podcast. Let's see, coming up tomorrow, we've got gubernatorial candidate Kevin Kiley. Next week, we've got a bunch of other candidates. I'm not going to say who it is right now because we're still trying to nail it all down. Next week, we also have the really interesting movement going on with the Latino community, the Hispanic community. Going to be a really interesting conversation next, I believe, Wednesday. So thanks for tuning into the Jobob Show. If you haven't already, check out my show Quality Control on Daily Caller. Also, thank you to capitalistpropaganda.us. Go and buy your capitalist propaganda gear. We have to defend capitalism. Make sure you tell your socialist friends that their ideas totally suck. That's all for us today. Thanks for watching the Jobob Show. We will be back here tomorrow with gubernatorial candidate Kevin Kiley at around 9 a.m. We'll see you next time.